So today I would like to share a little bit on what I've been thinking about in terms of the physics of rebirth. And it's not going to be a proof that rebirth happens or anything like that, but it's really the question of what are we talking about when we are talking about rebirth. And I like the term transmigration as an alternative. And the question comes up, well, what is transmigrating? And we can guess a couple of things, like especially if you're someone who already really believes in rebirth. You might say, well, yes, me, I am reborn in heaven or whatever it is. But Buddhism rejects the idea of some permanent, unchanging self. It isn't that after I pass away, I end up, born in a different place, but looking just like me, thinking just like me. That is not what happens. So a second option is, okay, but my soul is what's reborn. And this is kind of the Christian idea of heaven, I guess, right? Like, okay, my body isn't necessarily going to go to heaven, but my soul goes. And again, Buddhism, through great logic and reasoning, rejects the idea of some permanent, unchanging, monolithic soul that somehow is you. So, okay, if you're maybe beyond those ideas, but I know for me, initially when I was thinking about rebirth, it's okay, well, my mind is what goes on. My mind goes on to the next life. And it's a little bit tricky here because in some ways, yes, but most of the time when we're thinking about it, the mind becomes this very concrete entity. So in my next life, I maybe am reborn as a cat, and as that cat, I'm thinking, oh, I'm glad I'm a cat. In my last life, I really liked cats, and I'm still thinking in English and enjoying the naps I get to take. But that's not at all what it would be. I would have a cat mind. So how is my current human mind, which only has some cat tendencies, connected with that cat 100% cat mind? So again, too concrete if we just think my mind is what goes on. So this is a tricky thing to think about, and Samsara Nirvana Buddha Nature addresses this in a section called Who Revolves in Cyclic Existence? Because we somehow need to posit that rebirth exists, that karma functions, that what I do now actually matters for future lives, that I should care about future lives, but not fall to the extreme of thinking that there's some sort of real self or soul that goes on. So a quote from the Rice Seedling Sutra says, "Nothing whatsoever goes from this world to the beyond. Nevertheless, from causes and conditions, the effect of karma is manifested. It is just as in a clean mirror one sees the image of a face, but the image does not transfer into the mirror. Because the causes and conditions are complete, a face appears. Accordingly, there is not anyone who transfers from this lifetime at death. No one is born in another lifetime as well. Because the causes and conditions are complete, the effect of karma is actualized." And Nagarjuna also mentions this in his versed commentary on the Rice Seedling Sutra, saying that just as the distant moon appears in a small vessel of water, i.e. a reflection, but is not transferred there, karma and its function exist. Likewise, at death, nothing transfers from this life, but a being is born. If the causes and conditions are not complete, a fire does not burn. Once they are complete, the fire burns. So there's three kind of illustrations or analogies there. The idea of the reflection of a mirror, a face in a mirror, a reflection of the moon in, say, a small pot of water, and then the idea of, a fire burning if the causes and conditions are complete. So something that stuck in my mind the first time I read it, and I think I read it in one of the Library of Wisdom and Compassion books, but of course I can't find it now, is this set of 8 analogies for rebirth, which comes from the Sutra on the Questions Regarding Death and Transmigration. And this is a sutra that exists in the Tibetan canon and has been translated on 84,000. And I'm not entirely sure where or in what circumstance I read this, but it really stuck with me. And so in this, the Buddha is having a discussion with the king, his father, about death and what happens after death. Someone in the clan had died. They're doing all of these rituals of like making offerings to the deceased, and the king asks the Buddha if any of that matters. And the Buddha effectively says no, that isn't really what's happening. And then the king asks about rebirth. And the Buddha again explains this idea that, nothing permanent transmigrates. And so the king asks for some analogies to try to understand this. And the Buddha gives 8. Part of what I find so interesting about these 8 analogies is that not only are they illustrating an aspect of transmigration, but the whole set actually helps zero in on what we're talking about. Because if you only have one analogy, you might look at the certain parts of the analogy and come to the incorrect conclusion about transmigration and rebirth. But the set of them together have, I don't want to say contradict each other, but there are aspects of one that shows that that is not the part to think about in the other. So the 8 analogies, and I'll be reading from the 84,000 translation, is the analogy of students learning that which is recited by the teacher, a lamp being lit from another lamp, a reflection occurring because of a mirror, an impression and image coming from a stamp, fire coming from a magnifying glass, a sprout arising from a seed, the production of saliva when someone says the word sour, and the sound of an echo. So one of the things that this is really stressing is the idea that things arise from causes and conditions. That is one of the points that the Buddha comes back to every time. So all of these rely on causes and conditions. None of these phenomena are causeless. And again, one of the things that the Buddha keeps coming back to is that nothing permanent is transmigrating. And a face reflected in the mirror is a great example of that. Nothing from my face has gone into the mirror. The appearance of my face does not remain in the mirror, yet the mirror functions. The image in the mirror, arising from causes and conditions, functions. I can check and see, did I shave my head well or not? But nothing has actually transferred. In the case of a stamp, that's really trying to communicate this idea that what happens in one life, represented by the stamp itself, and you can think of this either as an ink stamp or like a signet to stamp into wax, that impacts what happens in your next life. So again, saying your next life seems to make it a little more concrete, but there is some relationship between the life I'm in now and my next life. And that relates back to karma. So even without anything really being transferred from the stamp into the wax, there is a relationship between them. And one of the other things that the Buddha needed to refute at the time, and I think some people still hold to this sort of idea, is that idea that since I'm human right now, in my next life, I will be human. That, that grasshopper out there has always been an insect. And it kind of makes sense, right? How could my current mind end up in a grasshopper? Well, so the example of sunlight coming through a magnifying glass and basically starting a fire is an example to kind of show that the effect doesn't have to be identical to the cause. That fire is neither light nor the magnifying glass, yet that is an effect that can arise from those conditions brought together. So there's other aspects of these that really could be taken out of context if there is only one analogy, and someone might be able to actually reinforce their incorrect understanding. So one being with the echo, the Buddha even points out the fact that someone might misunderstand this, but the other analogies refute it. So some others might use the analogy of echoing sound to say that rebirth does not come from causes and conditions, as they would maintain that such an analogy illustrates agency. So if we think about an echo, like me going and shouting in a valley somewhere, there was a person shouting, I had some agency. But rebirth isn't actually like that. It doesn't require me to really have a conscious desire to end up in a certain rebirth. It also doesn't rely upon an external being guiding me to a specific rebirth. It's simply occurring due to causes and conditions. And so if someone really focused on the echo, they might miss that aspect. A second one, again, maybe held by some people, is thinking that somehow our consciousness, as we're progressing through lives, can split into multiple pieces or get remixed together somehow. And again, the Buddha saw that one of these analogies, if taken without the others, maybe could reinforce that idea. He said, some might use the analogy of the seed to say that one consciousness grows to be many. For instance, like an acorn planted becoming an oak tree, which then has many acorns on it. Or what appears to be a single seed from a chard plant actually can create many chard sprouts. But the remaining analogies don't have that same sort of relationship. You can see how one is going to one in most cases. So I promised some physics in this talk. And while I was reflecting on these, and while I've been really trying to build my conviction in rebirth and understanding how transmigration occurs and karma functions without some concrete entity going on, I came up with a physics analogy that made a lot of sense to me. Now, I've learned that physics analogies that make a lot of sense to me do not necessarily make sense to other people, and often you have no idea what I'm talking about. So I have a video to show you so you can see what I'm talking about. I think many of you will actually be familiar with this. It's called Newton's Cradle, and it's about a 1-minute video. And the idea is that what happens on the left ball impacts what happens to the right ball, even though nothing is transferred between them. It's simply arising due to causes and conditions. And there's a few different demonstrations. If this was class, I would ask you to make predictions of what was going to happen. And then the last one starts to show where this analogy might break down a little bit if you took it too literally. Okay. So what can we take from this? So when we first show, say, intro physics students this demonstration, many questions come up that the students might have or that you might pose to them. And so one is like, how does the ball on the right know how high to come out? Because it pretty much comes out as high as the first ball started. Or in the second case, where 2 balls were pulled out, how does it know that 2 balls should come out to the side? Well, there's obviously nothing there that knows, right? It's just metal balls hanging. So that idea that there's clearly a pattern, there's clearly a relationship, and you don't have to have any agency for that to happen. This is simply just causes and conditions. Now, there's many aspects of this that you shouldn't focus on as an analogy that do not relate to rebirth. For instance, the balls go back and forth. That doesn't mean that we have a future life and then somehow go back in time. That is not the point. And in this case, you could clearly see me starting the ball. Again, that's not the thing to think about here. You could kind of imagine walking into the room and just seeing it going initially and not knowing anything about whether it even had a beginning. But what I really find helpful about this image in my mind is that idea that that first metal ball, there's no part of it that actually transfers to that last metal ball. Yet what happens with that first metal ball is really, in a way, determining what happens with that last metal ball. And so in that way, that's like thinking about how karma works, and that when I'm thinking about myself traveling into the future, what is there traveling into the future other than these arrays of cause and effect? So I don't know how many of you have seen the Newton's Cradle before, if this is an image that makes sense to you or not, but for me it's been really helpful in thinking about rebirth and trying to get to that nice middle way view where I have deep conviction in rebirth and the function of karma without actually reifying a self.